Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. The event is scheduled to start right about now. A few people will be joining as we come through. I am Steve Fazzari. I am professor of economics and sociology at Washington University, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on this important issue for American democracy. I am also director of the Wiedenbaum Center on the Economy, Government, and Public Policy at Washington University. The center supports a wide range of research in the social sciences on pressing public policy issues. We also present numerous programs that focus on key regional, national, and global challenges. I just heard somebody here. Make sure you're muted when you come in. The center presents these public affairs programs. All of you have connected today because you're interested in public affairs, and I encourage you to check out our website, which is wc.wustl.edu. It'll be posted in the chat. For information about upcoming programs. I also want to recognize and thank our co-sponsors for today's event, the Washington University School of Law, Public Interest and Policy Speaker Series, and the Gephardt Institute for Civic and Community Engagement. Well, it's fair to say we live in difficult times. We're all going through an enormously disruptive pandemic. There was rising political polarization leading to the contentious election of 2020, and those divisions seem even more severe over the past year. Specifically, a sizable minority of Americans question the legitimacy of our current president, and there's concerns about the election that have led to controversial changes to voting and election procedures that many believe will compromise our country's democratic principles. This is a topic of critical importance to the health and success of our country going forward, and I'm pleased that the Wiedenbaum Center can bring this discussion into the public eye with bipartisan perspectives from two political leaders with decades of experience in public service. So let me introduce our two speakers for today. The Honorable Russ Carnahan is part of a Missouri family well known for its public service. Russ holds a law degree from the University of Missouri and is now a senior policy advisor to the prominent international law firm, well known in the St. Louis region, Bryan Cave Leighton Paisner. Russ was elected to the Missouri legislature in 2000. He served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2005 to 2013 from the 3rd District following the retirement of Dick Gephardt. He held numerous important positions in Congress, including the senior Democratic whip. He was co-chair of the Bi-Partisan Center Aisle Caucus, and he received a presidential appointment as congressional delegate to the United Nations General Assembly. Russ continues to be actively involved in issues relevant to international business and government policy, and we're very pleased to have him with us today. Our second speaker is Tom Coleman, also has a very long career in public service. He was appointed by our own Jack Danforth as Assistant Attorney General in Missouri in 1969, elected to the Missouri legislature in the middle 1970s, and served 8 terms in the House of Representatives from 1976 to 1993 on the Republican side of the aisle, representing the Missouri 6 and the northwestern part of our state. Russ is described as a consensus-oriented legislator. During his time in Congress, he worked on agriculture, higher education, securing freedom of expression in the arts, and gender equity in college sports, among many other topics. Following his years in Congress, Tom was Vice President for Government Relations at BASF Corporation and worked on government affairs at several law firms. Tom holds a law degree from Washington University, a Master's of Public Administration from New York University, and like Murray Wiedenbaum, who are center honors, Tom taught courses at New York University on the intersection between government and business. Both of our speakers have been very active in efforts to protect democracy in Missouri, in the US, and even around the world. Just a few logistics about today's presentation. Following the presentations from Russ and Tom, we'll have the opportunity for some questions and answers. We have a big group today, so probably won't be able to get to everybody, but if you have questions, please type them in the Zoom chat window, and then I'll try to combine and moderate them in our Q&A session. To help me, your moderator, I please ask you to keep your questions somewhat succinct and respectful. For members of the media in the audience, our speakers will be happy to take questions directly from the press following the close of the presentation, so you should just stay on when we finish. So without any further ado, I'm happy to welcome the Honorable Russ Carnahan and the Honorable Tom Coleman to the Wiedenbaum Center and Washington University. I believe Tom's going to kick us off, so the floor is yours.
Steve, thanks a lot, and thank all the others at Washington University for their help at arranging this meeting today. I'm sorry it's via Zoom. we had planned to be in person throughout Missouri as we kicked off the Russ Carnahan and Coleman Save Democracy Roadshow. We have a show without a road, so we're going through the electronic road, and we'll do it as long as we can or have to until we can do it in person. And of course, as you mentioned, I'm a graduate of the law school at Washington University. The university itself has loomed very large in my life. I met my wife. She was an undergraduate on campus when I was in law school, and got a first-class education and also some very good professors, along with knowing Jack and Bill Danforth. As you mentioned, Jack appointed me one of his assistants, and then we worked together in the Congress for 16 years. And Bill Danforth, as chancellor, asked me to introduce legislation, which I did, of course, and it became law, and it's still law today, and that is to support graduate students in the areas of critical national needs. And so both the Danforths are very dear to me, as is Washington University. I had a professor at WashU, David Becker. He is the best professor I ever had, either undergraduate, graduate school, or law. And he gave 50 years to the university at the law school. And I'm so glad that he's a friend of mine, and I hope that he's watching today. Well, how did this come about, the roadshow? Well, Russ and I had written several op-eds last year. Well, actually one last year and one early this year. Last year, we were concerned about voting by mail for Missourians, and that's a very restrictive law. It's on the books. And so we wrote an op-ed saying, you know, we got a pandemic here. We ought to make it easier on people. And I'm not sure if anybody listened to us, but they did. They allowed people 65 and older to vote with absentee without any reason, just because they wanted to. And other restrictions were lifted by the governor. So we were very pleased with that. We didn't succeed so much in our second op-ed, which was asking that there be an independent commission appointed by Congress to study and to investigate the January 6th insurrection on Capitol Hill. Mm-hmm. We kind of focused on Roy Blunt because Roy is a very key person in the Senate, and we were hopeful that he would support what we wanted, and that was that independent commission. So we're batting 500. I'll leave it at that. But we started talking after the op-eds because we're so darn concerned about our democracy. And over a cup of coffee, we figured out that we wanted to do the roadshow. So we started out to do it. And as I say, the pandemic has slowed us down, but our desires and our hearts are still in it. We want to sound the alarm in the state of Missouri that we both know. I'm from Kansas City in the western part. He's from St. Louis in the eastern part. And we're going to go all over the state because we shouldn't take our democracy for granted. And I think we recognize that now after 4 years of chaos, and we want to do something about it. And if you don't do anything about it, it's very likely and very could go away. For the first time since the Civil War, we saw the actual transition of power stopped with that January 6th insurrection. And even after that, on the same evening of the insurrection, 147 members of Congress voted not to certify the electoral count and the vote that occurred. That is phenomenal. We've got to remember that and consider the ramifications, because those who want and tried to overturn the election the last time are very well going to try it again. So while we don't have the independent commission, we do have a select committee in the House of Representatives with subpoena power, as we've seen. And we hope to get to the bottom of it so that we can fix whatever we need to fix so it doesn't happen again. I will turn it over to Russ now. Russ, for any opening comments that you might want to have before we go on and just talk a little bit about why our democracy is in danger.
No, thank you, Tom, and thank you to WashU, Steve, for moderating. It's great to be with you all. I had the fortune of representing the St. Louis region, including WashU, during my 8 years in Congress. So I had the opportunity to be on campus and with programs and faculty and students many times. You're a phenomenal resource for our community and our country. Also, I want to give a shout out to Tom Coleman. Tom and I did not serve together. Our terms did not overlap. We're from different sides of the state. We served as two different political parties, but we've come together on this issue over coffee, but very concerned, as all of us should be, with the direction of our country and the security of our democracy. I was really blessed to be raised in a family that showed me great examples of public service. Watched my dad growing up, and he had a very high-minded and noble idea about public service, that it was worthy of your time and your life and your attention. It was a great example for me, and he shared that everywhere he went. And he really thought it was his responsibility to build trust between the government and those who were elected and those who were represented. And I think that's incumbent on all of us. But we've seen that trust torn at and shredded intentionally. And we've got to protect this nation and the democracy it was built upon, and the institutions that have been the guardrails for things not going completely off track. So I think that's part of really getting the message out there. We can't take this for granted. It is under siege. And I'm thankful to be doing this with Tom Coleman. I consider him a friend, consider him to be passionate about this. This is above politics and above party. This is really about our democracy and the way we express ourselves and represent ourselves and address problems and solutions in our country. So I'm happy to have this dialogue tonight and be with you all. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Russ. I'm going to lead off, and then Russ is going to follow me. We're going to kind of be back and forth and maybe even bounce around, but we thought we'd have some sort of cohesion to the presentation tonight. There was a poll done 30 years ago. They asked the public what they felt about the openness of the idea of having military rule in the United States. Pretty wild question to ask. You won't be surprised that only 6% of the people wanted military rule in the United States. You will not be probably surprised, but disheartened to find out that the answer today is 20%. Think about it. We often feel and think that democracies die with revolution, that there's some big takeover, but it doesn't happen that way in the 21st century. We have seen in Hungary, in Poland, in Venezuela, in Turkey, they've all lost their democracies by people who became elected in a democracy. They take power and then they turn the democracy out. And that's the very cliff that we seem to be standing on today. They do it through the handbook of the authoritarians. It's the same worldwide, and it's repeated constantly. The first thing they do is try to politicize independent institutions like the courts, like the people who actually administer the elections. They're not usually Democrats or Republicans, or if they're both, checking the other, but they're non-political people. But that's not what's going on, and we'll find out about that more tonight. Spreading disinformation. That's the key to a lot of stuff. Americans believe a lot of misinformation today. And that, of course, is the first way. When you can't believe anything, you'll believe anything. The big lie that Joe Biden's not the actual legitimate president of the United States. That's the biggest piece of misinformation. I mean, I saw a poll today by CNN that showed that even the vaccine in this country is politicized. 17% of the Republicans, 17% of the Democrats have not been vaccinated. 17% of the independents have not, but 60% of the Republicans have not. And, you know, when you start putting your life in danger for whatever, you got to wonder what misinformation they're relying on. The other things that authoritarians do is they build up the executive, or in these other countries, the presidency, our presidency, and we've done that ourselves. I think Russ would join me in saying that the Congress is pretty much dysfunctional anymore. The American people think that, and having witnessed it for a number of years, I believe it is. And that loss of support for the Congress and is another step towards the authoritarianism. So the last one is corrupt elections. And we will talk about it soon, about how you can corrupt elections, even when you are coming out with a report that says there was no corruption, that there was no fraud. Just having done the audit, so-called audit, is enough for a number of people to say, you know what, there was something wrong with that last election, because they did an audit, you know. So it's a challenge. It's the authoritarian handbook. It's been written for years. It's being followed, unfortunately, by one of the two major parties in this country. And we've got to recognize it and call a fact a fact. So Russ, I'll turn it over to you for any additional comments there.
You know, Tom, that's spot on. And I think the thing that is unusual and unprecedented about this, these anti-democratic and authoritarian actions of some, they're not even trying to hide it. You know, decades ago, this would be something people would do in secret and in the dark and try to be stealth about it. People are doing it in front of our eyes every single day, whether it's in Washington or state legislatures around the country. And we cannot sit on the sidelines and do nothing. We have to be sure people get facts about what are going on. We have to be sure that people that are doing this kind of action are called out and held accountable. And so that is really a big part of this conversation that we want to have with folks. This is not business as usual, where people sit around and they listen to political ads and they go vote or not vote. There's way more at stake. You know, we just celebrated Veterans Day a few days ago. People have fought and bled and died for these freedoms of this democracy that we enjoy. And we have to remember that and honor that and be sure that we're carrying that forward. So I think the urgency of this is upon us, and we must take it seriously. I think we're going to move on to the next segment, hear about what we can do to protect democracy. You know, first, you know, we start with protecting election integrity. There are assaults on our very election system on the front end, trying to make it harder for people to vote. On the back end, after the election, what's been termed voter nullification, to create systems that would attack the very counting and nonpartisan way that we do that. And so we've got to be sure we stay on that. We fully expect some of these type of measures have been brought up in our own state legislature in Missouri. And they've been brought up in other states, in a few successfully. We have to be sure that we stay on top of this with the next session coming up that starts in January in Missouri. We also know that the public supports these reforms to actually make our system better, not make it worse. When the Missouri voters passed the Clean Missouri amendments just recently, we saw the broad support of the public for these kind of reform measures. And to see some trying to go backwards against that is very telling. We also have to look at our strengthening our democratic institutions, many of which have been under fire. Tom mentioned the courts, the media, you know, our educational system, our healthcare system. just about every institution that we've relied on has been under attack if it doesn't fit the will of some political agendas. So I think addressing these structural and cultural factors have been really important in this conversation. And let me turn it over to Tom to follow up on this topic.
Yeah, Russ, I think you covered a lot of it. I have some of my oldies and goodies that I support change. I think we found out during 4 years of the last administration that the guardrails of democracy that we thought were always going to be in place, a lot of them were knocked down and some destroyed. And for example, there's an emoluments clause of the Constitution, which means basically you can't grift off of being in office. You can't participate in business activities that would reward you financially as a public official. We had a violation of the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act was passed many years ago to kind of keep politics out of the bureaucracy. And yet now we see the main people in the administrative branch going out and selling things. I mean, on the lawn of the White House, by Ivanka's, this dress from Ivanka. I mean, it's unbelievable what happened. And these kind of things need to be held accountable. We have to have an accountability or it's going to be much worse the next time. I have a concern about the Office of Legal Counsel who wrote a memo that covered Watergate back in the 70s. And it said that you cannot prosecute or charge a sitting president with a crime. And I believe that that ought to be removed from the Department of Justice and not followed, because nobody should be above the law, including the President of the United States. Another one is that we're going to have to, see if they run out the clock again in the courts. Being two lawyers here, you won't find a whole lot of lawyers bad mouthing the courts, but when the court does not expedite some of these very public and key democracy issues, and they let them languish for months. And everybody knows that when the Congress adjourns in January of 2023, it's all over. So that committee is going to be gone, regardless of who controls the House. And if you run out the clock in the court, you really, delayed justice is denied. And that's what we've seen before. And that's why I think we need to have a special court set up with jurisdiction to handle differences between the branches and solely between that. And that would be a full-time job probably, but it needs to be done. And finally, we'll get to it because all of the reforms that we will go to talk about are going to be a moot issue if we can't vote on them in the Senate. And we all know that the Senate is controlled by the filibuster rule, which requires 60 senators to agree on something to bring it to the floor of the House. That's got to be changed. That has to be dealt with. And we will talk about that in a little bit future here. Russ, it's all yours.
So let's highlight a few of these election sabotage schemes that we saw grow out of what Tom and others have appropriately called the big lie about the 2020 election being stolen. There's several categories of this legislation to sabotage the electoral process. First, legislation that will give state officials the power to change or reject election results. Also, legislation to give partisan state officials the power to seize control of the election administration and the vote counting process. Also, legislation to restrict or control or punish the conduct of local election officials. And finally, just legislation to make it harder to vote. We saw just the opposite of that, as Tom mentioned, during this election that happened in the middle of the global pandemic that made just some reasonable changes to the election laws to allow to make it easier to vote remotely, to make it easier to vote absentee, to get around, to have an exception to what has been the Missouri absentee law, which requires you to have an excuse as to why you want to vote absentee. And so those are just some examples of things that are going on around the country We expect some of those we've seen in Missouri already in the past session. We expect many more in this coming session. And again, many of those things are contrary to what voters have already expressed their support of on ballot measures. So we also, as part of that, we expect to see an attack on efforts to water down the initiative petition process itself in Missouri. It's been very popular with Missouri voters. It's an ability for voters to pass a law or change the Constitution to either fix something the legislature got wrong or do something where the legislature refuses to act. It's something that's very popular. It's necessary. And we know that because that's one of the few checks on our legislature that they don't like it. They don't like that check, and they're going to do everything they can to water that down and weaken it. Tom?
Yeah, well, as we mentioned, one of the things that undermines elections in the eyes of the voters who may become non-voters if they're discouraged enough is that we always question the outcome. And this was a national story, which you already know about Arizona. The Senate in Arizona decided that they were going to review the election results in Maricopa County, which is the largest county there in Phoenix. They went to a private contractor who had never done this before, who happened to be a very big supporter of the past president. And they spent millions of dollars doing it and came up finally after 8 or 10 months with no voter fraud. So you would say, well, that's great. That means that everybody thinks that Biden was the legitimate winner. But a poll was taken and it shows that asking the question, in fact, the Monmouth poll that came out yesterday has this as a conclusion. They asked the public, did Joe Biden win it fair and square, or was it stolen? And after this so-called audit and all the publicity around it and the report they issued, they said there was no fraud. 29% of the public still believes there must have been something wrong with the election results in Arizona. In Texas, we see wherever they can do it, they kind of put it to the minority community. In Houston, I think it's 8 or 9 million people. They're going to have one drop box for absentee ballots. That's a discouraging thing. Who's going to drive for miles to put their absentee ballot in the drop box? The Secretary of State is doing things. The governor is down the forefront of doing all these things, and I do know that he just got a significant opponent today in the election. Russ mentioned Missouri, and it's somewhat embarrassing to note that Missouri is already beginning to follow what's going on, and it's not just Arizona with the so-called audit. It's being done now in Pennsylvania and other places. Again, to erode the confidence, not that they're going to overturn anything, but that for the next time, maybe you won't go vote because your vote won't matter. And I think that's the whole mindset. I was doing a little research and I found out about House Bill 1301 in the Missouri House of Representatives. You won't believe this. It's only 1 page long, but it says that the legislature, in the determination to find fraud in an election, that they will investigate, and if they find fraud, they will overturn the election. They don't define fraud at all. And why would you overturn an election where you were on the ballot yourself? I mean, you talk about conflict of interest. This is the golden conflict. And so from that standpoint, this is what's going on in other states. Missouri has already filed that bill. As Russ said, there's going to be other things having to do with the voter initiative, but we have got to be very vigilant. And at our conclusion, we hope to be able to get a lot of the students interested in doing something about this. All of the things that we've talked about, how your vote can be nullified and done away with, destroyed by the legislature or somebody else. We have legislation now pending in the Congress that would overcome all of this stuff in the states. And it's very legal. If you look at the Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, gives the Congress the authority to overrule states, except for some minor thing like where the election was held or something. So from that standpoint, if this doesn't pass in Washington, we will see chaos in all the states, including our own. So the Freedom to Vote Act was passed, it's passed the House, but in the Senate is where the real challenge is going to be because of the 60 vote majority that you need. But it's going to be create national standards to protect the right to vote, the freedom to vote. It ends extreme gerrymandering, whatever extreme is. I looked at the bill, 20 pages of it has to do with gerrymandering, which is going to go on anyway, in one way or another, but we don't want it extreme, whatever that is. Stop partisan efforts to control the election administration. That's where they're installing their own people in all of these election boards around the country. If it was done in a communist nation back in the day when communist nations were out there, we would say, well, that's just part of their deal. Well, that's what they're trying to do here, is to put the political thumb on these people to decide to throw out your vote the next time around. It ensures that valid votes are actually counted. I mean, you would think that's a given. It limits the impact of after the fact partisan election reviews, which I just talked about in Arizona and Pennsylvania and other places for those same reasons. One of the things that is a very silent thing, and you really don't see it, is the intimidation of voters. In Texas, for example, they allow poll watchers, so-called poll watchers, to walk around and intimidate people. I mean, let's face it, it's an open carry state, okay? What do you think the average voter is going to think when the poll watcher is walking around, showing his authority or her authority in a partisan way? There's a lot more. The drop boxes would allow for a reasonable number of drop boxes. This is all within the Freedom to Vote Act. And one of the things we want to get students and everybody else on this Zoom call is to be sure that they make sure that Missouri and the representatives from our state are going to vote for this bill. So that's kind of what's in there. What's not in there is maybe as important as anything else. Let's remember January 6th and the insurrection was around the time, it was the same day of the counting of the electoral votes in a joint session of Congress. We know what happened that day, besides the insurrection. They had to then actually certify the votes. The vice president under the Constitution reads out the votes by the states. And if any member of the House or the Senate has an objection for whatever reason, they can make that objection. This is usually a non-entity. Nothing happens except for like this year. And as we know, one of our senators stood up and challenged several states' certification. We also saw that most of all but one, unfortunately, Republican member of Congress from Missouri voted not to certify the election, part of the 147. So from that standpoint, the law that governs this is called the Electoral Count Act. It's passed in 1887. It's so out of date, you can drive a Mack truck through the loopholes. And that's exactly what they were looking for on January the 6th. We have got to change that law, bring it up to date, and assure that it cannot be used to monkey around with our elections in the future, because it almost happened this year. And they were doing it through violence as well as following a script as to how to overturn the election. So from that standpoint, Russ, let's talk about what students particularly can do in our audience today to kind of right this ship of state.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. That was a great overview of the Freedom to Vote Act. I just want to add one thing about that. It is complementary to the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which many of you have heard about in the news, which is mainly focused on restoring civil rights protections in key states. So these bills are complementary, but they really address the heart of the problems that we ran into here around the January 6th insurrection. So let's talk about a few things that practical things all of us can do. Whether you're a student, a professional, retired, doesn't matter. First of all, you can vote. Nobody should be able to take that away from you. You should be conscientious about it. And secondly, don't just vote, but be informed when you do. Be sure you're voting for candidates that are actually pro-democracy and that are not trying to undermine it. That is critical. The other thing you can do, and just to share a shocking number, in Missouri, in the presidential race in 2020, Donald Trump carried Missouri over Joe Biden, but there were more non-voters in Missouri than Donald Trump voters. Let me say that again. There are more non-voters in Missouri than Donald Trump voters. And those are registered voters who didn't vote, and people who are eligible to vote but are not registered. So there's a huge number of people that are not even on the playing field. That for one reason or another, they're sitting out these elections when they have a lot at stake. And I think we all need to be thinking about how we talk to non-voters to get them on the playing field of democracy. They are part of the solution, and they need to be in the game. And then finally, really consider volunteering, donating, getting engaged with one of your elected officials or candidates. There's many events where you have an ability to participate locally in your community. I would encourage you to do that. Get to know some of your local, state, federal elected officials, work with them, and be sure they are, you're supporting them so they can be champions of democracy and stand up to these assaults, but also help find solutions. That's what I think we're all about here, to have this conversation focused on solutions and getting us there, but providing the support and encouragement and network to get us to that finish line. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A. Tom, if you've got anything else to add.
Well, I think you did. You covered it very well. I would just say this, that Russ and I, through the years, probably the least interesting thing we ever had to do was confront or be confronted by a single issue voter. If you're not for A, then I can't vote for you. And I can't believe I'm saying this. I want you to be a single issue voter. I want you to ask the people who are representing you, will they stand up by word and deed to support our democracy? Just ask that question. It might make them think and maybe do something that they weren't going to do before. We're down to where the rubber hits the road with our democracy. If we don't save it this time around, starting next year and 2 years later, it may be gone. We cannot take it for granted. I want to thank all of our listeners and viewers, and I look forward, as Russ does, to questions. So Steve, it's up to you now.
Thanks both Russ and Tom for addressing this really important issue and informing us about how you see it, given your long experience in public service. So we have a number of questions in the chat, and some that came in ahead of time. So let me just start off. One that's really very close to the Wiedenbaum Center in terms of its long-term interests, and this comes from our leadership team, Elizabeth Larson. Our center has a long history of exploring the relationship between business and government. So what do you think the business community should be doing on this issue to support voting rights and voting access? Well,
as you mentioned, I put together a course and taught it at NYU at the School of Public Service. I had the business school there, as well as the students for public policy. And I spent a good year getting ready for it and teaching it. I am so frustrated with the business community. they should be recognizing that a destabilized country is not good for business. And as I am fond of saying, that there are no headquarters of corporations in banana republics. And that's where all these other countries that I mentioned to you before, take a look at Venezuela. All the oil in the world they needed, all the money they needed, totally grifted and grafted off by the leadership. And now they're fleeing their country. They're starving and they have all these natural resources. So there's no corporate headquarters in Venezuela. And there's not going to be any in the United States if we allow this to occur. So I have been after the business community. Actually, when I was doing the work with NYU, we met with the Business Roundtable in Washington, the top 120 CEOs in the nation. We took a few baby steps with them, and then suddenly it went cold. They had a change in leadership, and the new leadership came on. I will say this, I guess it was a year and a half ago, that the Business Roundtable, who always thought that shareholder value was the most important thing for a corporation, has not just closed that down a little bit, they have expanded to about 6 different things, including their employees, their customers are important, and yada, 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 and the nation. I really took off when I saw the nation. I thought, maybe they're going to change their mind. They're right after all the problems down in Georgia. There was Delta Airlines, who I think is headquartered there, one of the big airlines, and Coca-Cola that's headquartered there, and a few other big names, said that they were not going to support anybody financially for office that engages in non-democratic ways and trying to shut people off from voting. Well, that lasted for a couple of months. Not all of them have caved in, but enough of them. And so there are other nonprofit groups in the country that are focusing on this, but it is really a good question. And I think if you belong, or if you're a shareholder or an employee of a corporation, you need to speak up because it's very short-sighted for these people not to recognize what a destabilized democracy or a former democracy would be like. It's never happened before. They've never experienced it before.
Russ, anything you want to add there before we move on?
Yeah, just that I think the business community, and Tom and I have had this conversation from the very beginning of our idea, that the business community is a really important partner in this conversation because they have a lot at stake. Their customers, their shareholders have a lot at stake in that community and government stability. Many companies spoke out. There were full-page ads, and I think the Wall Street Journal and some other publications where businesses signed on about standing up for our democracy. And as Tom said, many took actions where they suspended their political donations and their political action committees giving to people involved in the insurrection. But that hasn't continued fully. So I think, again, those businesses are reacting to community need and demand. And I think we need, shareholders and customers need to continue to demand those kind of practices that are good for business and good for stability in our country.
Well, thanks. I agree that it's an important direction. And again, one that from our point of view is something that we really focus on and our founder focused on. Let me move in a little different direction. There have been several questions, maybe 3 or 4 actually, that have just come in the last few minutes about the role of the federal government in the states. The question of whether the elections need to be more federalized. You mentioned the Voting Rights Act and the John Lewis Act, but do we need federal legislation to set national standards on voting opportunities? And do you think the Democrats are going in the right direction on this?
Well, I think it's the only direction, Steve, that we can go, that you can go now, because we've never seen what's going on in the states. This is very much different than anything we've ever experienced as a nation, perhaps other than after the Civil War and taking basically the rights away from the Black community during that period of time after Reconstruction. As a Republican, I was always concerned about overregulation and federal authority overreach. I still am, but it's not an overreach. I cited the Constitution. If you want to look it up yourself, it's Article 1, Section 4, and it talks about elections. And it says the states will have the authority to hold elections and so forth. However, the Congress can override those. And it's not necessarily the supremacy clause of the Constitution where federal law dictates over state law, like, for example, in Missouri, passing laws that contrary to federal law, you can't do that. But in this particular case, I think they're on very firm ground. We wouldn't be doing it if we didn't have to do it, but it has to be done in order to save the country. And it's not a violation of any constitutional provision.
And I think it can be done in a balanced way too, Steve, where again, it's not dictating every single aspect of elections, but it's setting some minimum basic standards and best practices to be sure that we can have uniform and credible national elections. And of course, the federal officials that are elected at the state level that make up our national government. So if those standards are being changed in such a way that it's not reflecting our democratic values or is anti-democratic, it's really weakening our entire system. So I think that's the balanced approach to setting these national minimum standards.
Although it does seem like it's going to be it's going to be a tough hill to climb, at least in the next few, and then even in the current Congress, it seems like there's basically no hope that some of these reforms are going to pass the Senate, with the filibuster at least.
Yeah, it's interesting, Steve, because yesterday Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer went out of his way to announce that they're going to consider this bill, and I think the John Lewis Voting Rights Act bill as well, before the end of this year. Now, whether or not they'll be successful, I don't know. But because there's only a 51 vote majority for the Democrats in the Senate, every single senator is very powerful. They hold off on this and that's it. And then you try to reach 10 members of the Republican Party to come over to create, the 60 votes, that's going to be very difficult. But if you can carve out from the filibuster rule, which is only a rule of the Senate, it's not in the Constitution, it's not in any statute, it's a rule that the Senate came up with, and they have changed it and modified it through the years. It can be modified again to save our nation.
So here's a question that's actually relevant to something that particularly Tom emphasized, but Russ, you also mentioned this as well, because there's a particular relevance to our students. And this comes from Stephanie Kurtzman, who directs the Gephardt Center, one of our co-sponsors. And first, what would you say to young people who question whether democracy is worth sustaining? And I do recognize in my own students that not so much on the democracy issue, but in general, they're questioning some of the more fundamental institutions of this country. And second, how specifically can young people become more involved in advancing their vision of an inclusive democracy serving Americans as a whole?
I think I'll do that in reverse order. I think young people, students have a really important part of this. They have more future than any of us involved, but they also should know their history, know the history of other countries that have struggled with authoritarian governments, know the history of democratic governments that have been challenged or failed, and see what the consequences have been. So we can learn a lot from that history. I think young people have enormous opportunity to engage and make a difference. I mentioned several, from voting, getting involved with an elected official, a candidate, many advocacy organizations, whether it's an environmental group, a civil rights group. You can just go down to so many different organizations that are actively involved in advocacy and organizing and networking. You can help make a difference, but also just the personal and professional networking can be invaluable to you throughout your career and your lifetime. So take advantage of that. Being on a world-class university campus, you've got so many opportunities to do that. Be sure you carve out some of your time from your studies and your other work to do that, because that can be some of the most beneficial thing to you, your career, and your community. So I really encourage you to do that.
Steve, I understand what you feel from the students that you have talked to about this. The polls indicate that that's an absolute correct statement that you made, that they are less, they're cooled on some of our democracy. And for whatever reason, we need to find out from them. But I think what Russ just said, in my own personal experience, I was at the end of between my second and last year in law school, was when Jack Danforth ran for Attorney General. And I saw this dynamic young man, a reformer, and I volunteered for him. I was probably the chief volunteer in that whole damn campaign. But the point of it was that maybe my grade slipped a little bit, that my time slipped a little bit, but it was certainly worth it. The experience of working with somebody that you can believe in. And I got the same advice from somebody who was very high up in the Republican Party when I was in graduate school in New York. He said, go back to Missouri, find a candidate that you believe in, and then you will be able to succeed through politics. And I followed that advice. I just happened to stance that it was the year that Jack first ran for Attorney General and sought office. But I think Russ is right. We need to give the young people, and I believe the young people will solve this problem for us, because they don't have a lot of the, instinctiveness of, oh, I'm always a Democrat, or I'm always a Republican, or they're good people and they're bad people. They haven't developed these kind of prejudices yet. And so they need to vote more. They need to be more active. And I would say one of the things, just to follow on from our own conversation today, monitor what goes on in Jeff City and find out if they're doing all these crazy things that the rest of the states are doing. And go down there and organize yourself. Speak up. Get a hold of the local people in the St. Louis area or wherever you're from, because Washington U is a national university. I'm sure you're from all the states and many countries, but what you can do is important. One person can make a difference, and don't sell yourself short on that.
Thanks. That's a good specific advice, I think, for people that do care about this. Students, younger, older, all the way across the spectrum of our citizens. Let's go back to gerrymandering. You mentioned it briefly. Again, one of the people that helped organize this event, Greg McGarrigan from the law school, had specifically talked about how extreme partisan gerrymandering is back in the news. The U.S. Supreme Court has declared that the federal courts may not hear legal challenges to partisan gerrymanders, so it's kind of off the table, if I understand right. And what do you think? I think you mentioned already that gerrymandering is a concern, but in light of the Supreme Court's ruling, what actions can be taken to address this issue?
Well, the parallel to partisan gerrymandering that the courts have continued to review is gerrymandering based on race, which sometimes parallels partisan politics. And so there still is an opportunity to have gerrymandering reviewed. I mentioned also many states, including Missouri, had passed initiatives to reform the redistricting process. Iowa, for example, has a nonpartisan way to do it. California has a nonpartisan citizens commission. And so you see a movement among states to undo that. And so there's one route to have states do it through their legislature, another route to do it through citizen ballot initiatives, and another another path to go through the courts. So I think that fight is going to be renewed here with this current round of redistricting. And I think that fight's going to be among all those fronts.
Well, we may see it in the state of Missouri because they're undergoing, and the legislature is in charge of this. There's no commission here. And if you read the news, it looks like they may go after one of the two Black minority members of Congress. And that would be, I think, again, we'd have to look at the figures on this, but what Russ said was true. If you start gerrymandering on racial basis, then you violated other laws and you can't get away with it. But I think we got to watch very closely. Even the Republican Secretary of State, Mr. Ashcroft, recently said that he believes instead of having just 6 Republican Congress people in office for Missouri, that there should be 7. And of course, the only way you could probably do that is through the 5th district in Kansas City, and expand that out into the suburbs to make it more difficult for the gentleman to win again. But I went through redistricting. I was a member of the other party. The Democrats were in control, and they wanted to eliminate me. And so what you do, you fight back. And we got the local newspapers on our side. We organized buses loads of people to go down to Jeff City. I testified against it, of course. They still slammed it at us, and eventually went to the federal courts, and a federal judge who I never knew or saw or talked to found in my favor. And the rest, as we say, is somewhat history.
Very interesting. Well, we're running up against the end of our time, but just maybe one last question here, which is, what are your expectations for 2022 and maybe especially 2024 in this context?
Well, I think so much of our politics is based upon knee-jerk reaction in a partisan way. If you look at the polls, it shows that, for example, the people, when the Republicans were in power, the White House, they thought the economy was good and everything was rosy. As soon as Joe Biden was elected, it went down. Vice versa for the Democrats. We've got to get out of this. These two warring factions, and Russ has been a leader in trying to get people. When he was in Congress, we didn't have this problem when I was in Congress because we could get along. We had bipartisanship. I was a Republican in a minority for 16 years. I got a lot of legislation passed. You work together. It's not done now, and it's a sad thing because when you have 330 million people in 50 different states of all walks of life and all philosophical persuasions and politics, you got to compromise. And the public, oh, compromise, that's terrible work. Compromise is what this whole system's built on. And if you don't compromise, you get nothing. And that's what we have. We have a dysfunctional Congress, or a Congress who is already, as we say, trying to end Joe Biden's career already by not supporting any of his stuff. Like this infrastructure bill, with if Russ and I had it in front of us, would start figuring out how it's going to help our districts. There wasn't one Republican in the entire House of Representatives, except for 13 that voted for it. None of the Missouri delegation did. And it's amazing. How can you go back and answer questions about that? I don't know.
Yeah, I guess, Steve, to wind up, I would describe myself as a stubborn optimist. Well, I think the threat is real and is imminent and serious. I think we have the wherewithal to learn from history. I think we have the institutions that people value and are worthy of protection. And I think we will get through this dark time period, but it's going to take action and engagement from people across this country. And that's why I've been so proud to stand up with my friend Tom Coleman and help give voice to this, to encourage people to engage and make a difference. Now's the time.
Well, thanks, Russ and Tom. That's a great way to maybe wrap up the public portion of the event. I want to thank all of you for being part of this important discussion. Thank in particular our speakers for their time and organization and giving us really a wide-ranging discussion. I'm sorry I didn't get to everybody's question. I think we covered a lot of them, some that maybe not directly, but I think a lot of them have been addressed in many ways. It has been a respectful and obviously very important discussion. So thank you on the part of the Weidbaum Center in Washington University. We will close the public portion of our event right now. If people from the media want to take a few questions or pose a few questions for Russ and Tom, they're willing to hang on. I'm just going to mute my screen here for about 30 seconds, and then I'll be back and we can start the media portion. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again. You're a great host and a great moderator.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, and all the team there at Washington University.